In the cold stillness of Alaska's wilderness, a hunter's boot struck something that wasn't earth. What he first thought was driftwood was in fact a human bone. Nearby, half buried in the moss, lay a small pink shoe, the kind worn by a child. For 2 long years the forest had kept its secret, the silence around the disappearance of the Scott family unbroken. But that morning the stillness cracked. The hunter froze, aware that he had stumbled upon the end of someone's story, or perhaps the beginning of another. What began as an ordinary camping trip for a young family would soon unravel into a case that baffled police, consumed an entire community, and revealed a truth far darker than anyone could imagine. This is not fiction. This is the true story of how hope vanished and how the wilds of Alaska finally spoke. Michael Scott was the sort of man people described as solid, a quiet, dependable presence, grounded like the earth beneath Alaska's endless sky. At 34, he worked as a construction engineer in Anchorage, the kind who preferred precision over words. He'd grown up here, among the mountains and rivers, the kind of boy who learned to read animal tracks before he could drive a car. Nature wasn't a backdrop for him, it was home. Sarah, his wife, couldn't have been more different. She was 32, a graphic designer from Oregon who saw beauty in city lights and coffee shops, not in the icy breath of the Alaskan wilds. Yet love had brought her north, and over the years she had learned to share her husband's affection for the wilderness, or at least to tolerate it, for his sake and for their daughters. Lily was 5, all curiosity and unfiltered laughter, a little girl who carried her world in a battered teddy bear. To her, the forest was magic, a playground bigger than imagination itself. When Michael suggested one last weekend trip before autumn gave way to snow, Sarah hesitated, but Lily's excitement was contagious. They chose a well-trodden path through Chugach State Park, a vast expanse of spruce forests, glaciers, and mountains that looked eternal beneath a fading summer Sunday. The plan was simple: a 2-night camping trip, nothing ambitious, a short drive from home, and a few kilometers of hiking to a familiar stream. Michael promised it would be easy, safe, even a place they'd visited before. On Friday morning, 12 August 2021, the Scott family loaded their old blue Ford Explorer with sleeping bags, a small barbecue grill, and a cooler packed with sausages, marshmallows, and bottled water. It was the sort of scene any family might live through without giving it a second thought, a short escape from work emails, deadlines, and school routines. On their way out of Anchorage, they stopped at a local supermarket to pick up a few last-minute items. The security footage captured them one final time. Michael was pushing the trolley, Lily perched inside it with a grin wide enough to fill the frame, while Sarah walked beside them, her hair tied up against the wind. They looked ordinary, content, and very much alive. That short clip would later be broadcast across every local news channel in Alaska, a few seconds of mundane happiness that, in hindsight, felt unbearably tragic. In it there were no hints of fear, no shadows lurking behind them, just a family about to step quietly out of the world's reach. It was the last proof that the Scotts existed as a family, intact and unbroken. By noon, they had left the city behind. The roads narrowed, the landscape opening into a sprawl of pine and silence. Michael hummed along to the radio while Sarah read aloud the directions, glancing back occasionally to check on Lily, who was singing to her bear. At the trailhead near Eagle River, they parked the car, locked it, and began the gentle ascent into the woods. The sun was still high, the air crisp with that clean, almost metallic scent of Alaskan air that city dwellers always describe but never quite capture. Had anyone passed them that afternoon, they would have seen nothing unusual, just a family walking into the forest, carrying more warmth than caution. They were not adventurers courting danger. They were simply people chasing peace. And yet, somewhere beyond the tree line, the story that began as a weekend escape would twist into something far colder. The world at that moment still seemed kind. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. By Monday morning, Anchorage was already sliding back into routine. Emails were answered, phones rang, the steady pulse of ordinary life resuming after the weekend. But at one construction firm on the city's outskirts, a desk sat empty. Michael Scott hadn't shown up for work. At first, no one panicked. People get sick, cars break down, families extend holidays. But by noon, his colleague Dan began to feel that quiet, creeping unease reserved for moments when something doesn't sit right. Michael was the kind of man who arrived early, not late. When calls to his mobile went unanswered, and Sarah's phone also rang into silence, unease turned to concern. By evening, that concern had become dread. Sarah's sister, Jessica, was the next to raise the alarm. She'd been expecting a call from her sister Sunday evening, just a quick check-in to say they'd made it home safely. When that call never came, she'd convinced herself they were simply tired. But by Tuesday morning, with no messages, no social media activity, and neither of them at work, the truth could no longer be ignored. Jessica went to the police and filed a missing persons report. The authorities acted quickly. Alaska is not the kind of place where you wait and see. The wilderness can swallow people whole. Within hours, a state trooper helicopter was circling the area near Eagle River, the last known destination. From above, nothing looked out of place. The forest was vast and indifferent, its surface unbroken. When the ground search began the following day, rescuers found the Scott's blue Ford Explorer neatly parked at the trailhead. The doors were locked, the windows clean of fingerprints. Inside were Lily's small pink sweater and a few children's books. The car smelled faintly of marshmallows and pine, the scent of a family trip that should have ended on Sunday evening. Further along the trail, the search dogs caught a scent. They followed it confidently through dense undergrowth, the handlers calling out into the woods, names echoing, unanswered. After several kilometers, the dogs led them to a small clearing beside a stream. There stood the Scott's camp. The tent was upright, pegged firmly into the earth, the flap unzipped and thrown open. Inside were 3 sleeping bags, 2 large, 1 small, laid out side by side. None appeared to have been used. On a small folding table sat neatly packed sandwiches, apples, bottles of water, and a sealed bag of marshmallows. The barbecue grill beside it was cold, unused. It looked less like a scene abandoned in panic and more like one paused mid-sentence. Near the tent lay Lily's teddy bear, the same one from the supermarket, footage resting on a child's sleeping bag as though waiting for her return. The family's backpacks were stacked at the entrance, containing spare clothes, torches, and toiletries. Everything was there, perfectly ordinary, except for the family themselves. And there was one other detail that unsettled the search team. Michael's hunting rifle, a Winchester .308, he always carried on camping trips, was missing. So were both adults' mobile phones, wallets, and identification. The first thought, as always in Alaska, was bears. The region was known for its grizzlies, and encounters were not unheard of. But there were no signs of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood, no claw marks. A bear driven by hunger would have ripped through the supplies first, but the food lay untouched, the tent was intact. Even the faint circle of flattened grass where a fire might have been built remained undisturbed. The dogs, after circling the camp, began to behave strangely restless, confused, unable to follow any scent beyond that point, as if the trail had simply vanished into thin air. Investigators began to work through the possibilities. Perhaps an accident, they might have gone to fetch water and slipped into the stream. But the current was shallow, and divers scoured the length of it for days without finding a trace. No scraps of fabric, no footprints downstream. Then came the theory of a voluntary disappearance, the idea that the Scotts had chosen to vanish. Detectives combed through bank records and passports, but there were no large withdrawals, no tickets purchased, no digital breadcrumbs leading anywhere. Their passports sat untouched at home. It made no sense. By the end of the first week, more than 60 volunteers, park rangers, and police officers had searched the surrounding forest. They covered ravines, ridgelines, and miles of undergrowth, calling out names that faded into the wind. Each evening they returned empty-handed. The case was beginning to feel less like a rescue and more like a riddle. The camp became a kind of shrine, a frozen moment of family life preserved in the wilderness. Every small object seemed to hum with meaning: the unopened bag of marshmallows, the folded blanket, the quiet stillness that clung to the place. It wasn't chaos that frightened the rescuers, it was order. By the second week, the tone of the search shifted. There were fewer calls for the family to shout back from the trees. Instead, there were questions whispered among the searchers: how does a family of 3 disappear without a sound? And although no one said it out loud, they all knew what it meant when the forest gave nothing back. When the initial shock of the family's disappearance began to settle, the investigation shifted into a colder, more methodical rhythm. What had started as a frantic rescue mission now became an exercise in deduction, and the Alaskan wilderness, so vast, so indifferent, was treated like a crime scene. Detective Mark Miller, a veteran of the Anchorage State Police, took charge of the case. He was not the kind of man who believed in mysteries. To him, everything left a trace if you knew where to look. But even he found the Scott case unnerving. There was no violence, no evidence of flight, no signs of life, just absence. The first theory on the table was the obvious one: a wildlife attack. It was Alaska, after all. The park was known for grizzlies and moose. Even an experienced hiker could misjudge a moment. But when wildlife officers examined the campsite, their conclusion was immediate. There were no paw prints, no claw marks, no shredded fabric, and no trace of blood. The tent was unscathed. The food, still neatly packaged, would have been irresistible to any hungry animal. A bear leaves chaos behind, it doesn't tidy up. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't nature's doing. The wilderness was silent, but clean. Then came the second theory: an accident. Perhaps one of them had gone to the stream, slipped, and drowned. It was a comforting possibility, in a strange way, a tragic misstep, rather than something darker. Search teams combed the stream bed for days. Divers worked the pools and backwaters, their torches slicing through the icy water. They found nothing. No clothing, no hair, no fragments of fabric snagged on the rocks. The water was too shallow to have carried 3 bodies away, unnoticed. An accident might take one person, even 2, but not an entire family without leaving so much as a trace. When the natural explanations failed, attention turned to something more human. Could they have chosen to disappear? It was rare, but not impossible. Families did sometimes flee their lives: debts, secrets, exhaustion. Investigators began digging through the Scotts' finances, searching for hidden stress. They found that Michael had once tried to start a small construction business that went under, leaving him with modest debts. But nothing that could explain an elaborate escape. There were no large withdrawals, no travel bookings, no cash movements that might fund a new start. The passports were still at their home. Even their mortgage and utilities were paid up to date. The family hadn't packed for an escape, they'd packed for a weekend. The voluntary disappearance theory soon collapsed under its own weight. People who run away leave behind breadcrumbs, an email, a phone signal, a hint of planning. The Scotts had left nothing. The tent stood like an empty stage after a play, its actors vanished mid-scene. That left the darkest explanation: abduction. It was the most unsettling and the least likely. The park was remote, the trails long, the population thin. Who would abduct a family of 3 from the middle of the forest? For ransom, they weren't wealthy. For revenge, they had no enemies. Detectives widened their net, interviewing every visitor who had signed into the park's voluntary register that weekend. It was a long, frustrating process. Many hikers never bothered to log their entry. Still, a few testimonies stood out. One man, a retiree in his 60s, said he'd passed a young family matching the Scotts' description late Friday afternoon. A tall man, a woman with a backpack, and a little girl skipping between them. They had exchanged polite greetings. Half an hour later, the same witness recalled passing another hiker heading in the same direction. He described him as tall, thin, with stubble and a dark jacket. Nothing unusual except for his demeanor. He hadn't smiled or nodded, he just stared at the ground and kept walking. There was something about him, the man said later. A heaviness, like he didn't want to be seen. The statement was too vague to build on. In the Alaskan wilderness, a tall, thin man with a backpack could describe half the population. No one else reported seeing anyone suspicious, no vehicles parked off-road, no camps nearby. Still, the image of that lone figure lingered in the case files, a ghostly silhouette on the margins of the investigation. Weeks passed. The search operation grew smaller as volunteers returned to work and the weather began to turn. Each theory had been tested, dismantled, and discarded. Wildlife, no evidence. Accident, no remains. Voluntary disappearance, no motive. Abduction, no suspect. What was left was nothing at all. For Detective Miller, that was the hardest part to accept. Most investigations left patterns, traces of fear, desperation, or struggle. This one left stillness. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only a perfect silence. He kept going back to the same phrase in his notes. Everything was in place, except for the people. It haunted him. By the end of September, the official search was scaled back. The case remained open, but active efforts had ceased. What was once a rescue had become a file, in a drawer marked unsolved. The only thing that endured was the image of that empty tent beside the stream, untouched by time. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something had happened to the Scott family. But for now, it was just a whisper in the wind, a mystery waiting for the forest to give up its secret. By the end of September, the search had thinned to a handful of weary faces and half-charged radios. Rain had started to fall more often, soft at first, then in steady, punishing sheets that turned the forest floor into mud and the rivers into gray ribbons of noise. The helicopters stopped flying. Their low thrum had once been the sound of hope, but now the skies were too unpredictable. The official statement came a few days later: the operation would be suspended. The weather was worsening, the resources stretched thin, and no new evidence had surfaced in weeks. For the officers who had walked the same trails every day, it felt less like a decision and more like surrender. The forest, it seemed, had won. When Jessica Scott heard the news, she sat motionless for a long time. Her sister's name was still written in her phone, the last text unread, a picture of Lily roasting marshmallows sent months before. She had called the detective again and again, asking if they were sure. Couldn't they keep looking a little longer? But the answers were always gentle, professional, and final. The file was not closed, they said, only paused. To Jessica, the word sounded like a lie. At first, she tried to keep the case alive. Every few weeks she posted on social media, sharing pictures of the family, reminding people that someone out there knew something. Volunteers promised to return when the snow melted. Reporters came once or twice, their cameras fogging in the rain, asking questions that had already been answered 100 times. "Do you believe they're still alive?" Jessica didn't know what to say. The truth was that hope had become a kind of punishment impossible to let go of and impossible to live with. Detective Miller called her once every few months. The conversations were always brief. "No new developments," he would say, his tone respectful but hollow. The police still checked any remains found in the wilderness, still cross-referenced missing persons reports, still ran DNA samples against the database, but nothing matched. In the department, the Scott file became one of many cold cases gathering dust. It moved from the front of the shelf to the middle, then further down. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell over Chugach in late October, covering the ground where the tents had once stood. By November, the park was a white desert, the trails erased. Hunters avoided the area. It had a reputation, now a place that swallowed people. The silence of the forest grew heavier with the snow, and the search, once so full of noise and human will, was buried with it. In Anchorage, life went on. Christmas lights appeared on windows, traffic thickened, New headlines replaced old ones. The Scott family slipped quietly from conversation, surviving only in fragments of file number, a photo pinned to a corkboard, a whisper between officers who had once walked the search line. Jessica stopped checking her phone at night. The calls from unknown numbers had once filled her with a jolt of hope. Now they only brought exhaustion. She still kept Lily's drawings pinned above her desk, a reminder of something warm in a world that had turned cold. As months turned into a year, the story became part of local folklore, the family that vanished. Hikers passing through Eagle River still found the place eerie. Some claimed they heard voices in the wind, others said their dogs refused to go near the old campsite. The rational minds dismissed it as imagination, but deep down, everyone who lived nearby carried the same unease. There was something about the way the case had ended, or rather, hadn't that refused to settle. When spring finally returned, the snow melted into the soil, and with it came the faint renewal of movement. Wildflowers pushed through the earth, covering the traces of the search. The tent had long been removed, but the ground still held the faint square imprint where it had once stood. Nothing else remained. No markers, no tape, no sign that 3 lives had ended or vanished there. 2 years passed in that strange limbo. Time dulled the sharpness of grief, turning it into a quiet ache. Jessica went back to work. Detective Miller moved to another division, yet both carried the same thought that lingered in the background of every ordinary day, that somewhere, just beyond reach, lay the truth. It had to be out there, hidden in the vastness of the Alaskan wild, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And then, one crisp October morning, a man walked into that same wilderness, rifle slung over his shoulder, looking for moose. When his boot struck something hard beneath the moss, he almost ignored it. Almost. The silence of 2 years was about to break. It was a little after midday when the silence broke. The hunter's name was George Riggs, a 58-year-old electrician from Anchorage who spent most of his free time in the wild, chasing solitude more than sport. That afternoon, deep in the northern stretch of Chugach, he stumbled on something pale jutting through the moss. He thought it was a piece of birch bark or driftwood, half rotted by the weather. But as he brushed the damp leaves aside with the tip of his boot, he froze. It wasn't wood at all. It was bone-long, narrow, unmistakably human. Nearby, half buried in the soil, lay a tiny shoe. It was pink once, now dulled by rain and time, with the cartoon outline of a rabbit barely visible on the side. George stood there for a long time, the stillness around him louder than any sound. He knew what he had found. By the time he reached an area with phone signal, the light was fading. His voice shook as he told the dispatcher what he'd seen. Within hours, the state police had assembled a forensic team. The next morning, helicopters cut through the gray sky above the forest, lowering officers and equipment into the clearing George had marked with broken branches. The coordinates placed it roughly 9 kilometers from where the Scots camp had once stood. It was almost impossible, terrain dense, wet, and overgrown, the kind of place no one would stumble upon unless they were very unlucky or very persistent. The excavation began slowly. The bone and the shoe were lifted carefully, bagged and labeled before being flown to the forensic lab in Anchorage. Back at the site, the team spread out in widening circles, probing the soil for more. Dogs trained to detect human remains were brought in. They barked and whined in the thick undergrowth, leading handlers from one false alarm to another until, nearly a week later, one of them began scratching at the base of a fallen tree. Trunk. Beneath the roots, under a thin layer of dirt, they uncovered a skull. It was almost intact, save for a small, neat hole at the back, the kind that could only be made by a bullet. That single discovery changed everything. The Scott case, long dormant, was reopened overnight. DNA testing confirmed what the detectives already suspected. The tibia and the shoe belonged to 5-year-old Lily Scott, the skull to her mother, Sarah. For Jessica, the phone call from Detective Miller was both a blow and a strange form of relief. 2 years of not knowing had been replaced by something definite, horrific, but real. For the first time, there was proof that the family hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had made them vanish. The forensic examination deepened the mystery. The bones were scattered across a wide area, suggesting they had once been together and later moved by weather or animals. But the skull told its own story. The hole at the base matched the caliber of a .308 hunting round, the same type fired by Michael Scott's missing Winchester rifle. It seemed almost certain that the weapon used to kill them had been their own. Still, Miller knew that physical proof mattered more than theory. He sent the remains back to the lab for microscopic analysis, hoping for something, anything, that could identify the person who had left them here. It was there that a breakthrough emerged, small enough to be missed by anyone less patient. On one of Sarah's pelvic bones, an analyst noticed a faint dent and several fine scratches. Under magnification, the marks looked deliberate, as though made by the tread of a boot pressing down on soft flesh. Within those tiny grooves were specks of black material. The lab confirmed it was rubber. Someone had stepped on her body after death, hard enough for the sole to leave its trace. The print was partial, but detailed enough to reconstruct its pattern. A distinctive diamond-shaped tread used in heavy work boots. Size 46. A large man. It was the first solid clue the investigation had seen in 2 years. Miller felt the rush of purpose again. They finally had something tangible, something that could connect a human being to this horror. Within days, detectives began tracing the sale of that specific model. Anchorage wasn't London, but it was still a sprawling city, with hundreds of shops selling outdoor and industrial gear. Every receipt, every credit card purchase, every shipment was reviewed. The process was exhausting, the paperwork mountainous. Most customers were fishermen, builders, or hunters. Yet the more names they crossed off, the clearer the picture became. Whoever had worn those boots was still out there, still living, among them, perhaps even walking past the very officers who searched for him. Meanwhile, the search area around the discovery site expanded. More fragments of bone appeared, a rib here, part of a jaw there, confirming that animals had indeed scattered the remains over time. The forensic map began to fill with red pins marking each find, and slowly a pattern emerged, leading roughly back towards the direction of the old campsite. Every piece of evidence felt like a whisper from the dead. The bullet hole, the footprint, the missing rifle, all fragments of a story that was beginning to take shape. For the first time, the forest was giving something back. And for Detective Miller, it meant one thing only. The Scott family had not been lost to nature. They had been murdered, deliberately and efficiently. Someone had walked into those woods and taken 3 lives, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint imprint of a boot. The discovery reignited the case, drawing fresh media attention and a surge of public interest. But beneath the noise, the investigation remained fragile, a single thread stretching between the living and the dead. Somewhere in Anchorage, perhaps on a construction site or a fishing dock, a man with very large boots was going about his life, unaware that the forest had finally started to speak his name. When the arrest finally came, it was almost anticlimactic. The man was stopped at the port, trying to board a cargo ship headed south, his papers worn, his eyes hollow. On his feet were the same size 46 rubber boots. In his backpack, detectives found 3 spent, 308 casings, and a faded photograph. Lily Scott smiling at the camera, her hair caught in the wind. It was the detail that broke the room's silence. Even the most seasoned officers paused before breathing again. The DNA results confirmed what instinct already knew. Traces of Sarah's blood were still embedded in the fabric of that same bag. Under the flickering light of the interrogation room, he spoke without emotion. His story was blunt, stripped of remorse. He had been camping nearby, seen the family's supplies, and waited until nightfall to steal what he could. When Michael confronted him, he panicked, grabbed the rifle, and fired. Then, as the forest fell quiet, he turned the weapon on Sarah and on the small girl who screamed her mother's name. It was quick, he said, almost mechanical. The confession closed the file, but not the wound. The remains of Michael Scott were recovered weeks later in a ravine a mile from where his wife and child had been found. There were no funerals, only a quiet gathering by the river where the family had once camped. Justice, when it came, felt thin, a late echo in a landscape that had already forgotten. The forest, vast and unchanging, kept its calm. But for those who remembered the Scotts, Alaska would never sound truly silent again.